Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Norton Museum of Art. My name is Jody Seifer. I'm the Director of Adult Learning and Engagement. I'm really delighted to see you all here today. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, if you can please take a moment to silence your devices. We really appreciate that. We are recording this lecture, so we also appreciate your acknowledgement of that. And when we have the Q&A at the end, we do have a microphone set up in the aisle. So if you would please get up. If you need me to walk around and give you the mic, I will. But if you can get up to the microphone so that it's in the recording, we really appreciate that. We'll mention that again at the end. So I would love to take a moment to thank our three curators and our two distinguished guests, Stephanie Heydt, Audrey Lewis, and of course Ellen Roberts, for taking the time to be here today, making the trip, and for this beautiful exhibition. I hope you have all seen it, and if you haven't, that you will take the time to go through it after the talk. I am going to be introducing Ellen Roberts, who will then introduce our two guests. Ellen E. Roberts is the Harold and Anne Berkley Smith Senior Curator of American Art at the Norton Museum of Art and has been the Curator of American Art here since 2012. She's curated 18 exhibitions here at the Norton, including the traveling shows Gertrude Vanderbilt, Whitney, Sculpture, 2018, and O'Keeffe, Stettheimer, Tor, Zorak, Women Modernists in New York in 2016, for which she also wrote catalogs. She's authored a book on museum founder Ralph Norton and his collecting as well. She has published extensively during her tenure at the Norton and in her previous role as Associate Curator of American Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she co-authored collection catalogs on American Modernism and American Impressionism, and co-curated exhibitions on Edward Hopper, the Arts and Crafts Movement, Food and American Painting, and Frank Lloyd Wright and Japanese art. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Yale University and a PhD in art history from Boston University. So please give a warm welcome to Ellen Roberts.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. We're excited to have our two distinguished guests here to discuss their exhibition, Joseph Stella, Visionary Nature. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about them, and then we'll start our discussion. Stephanie Heydt has been the Margaret and Terry Stent Curator of American Art at the High Museum of Art since 2019. There, her exhibitions and catalogs have included Joseph Stella, Visionary Nature, Something Over Something Else, Romer Bearden's Profile Series, Rising Up, Hale Woodruff's Murals at Talladega College, Go West, Art of the American Frontier from the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, and Simple Pleasures, Still Life and American Art. Her upcoming projects include exhibitions on Winslow Homer's and Eastman Johnson's post-Civil War paintings of women, the late 19th century painter Fidelia Bridges, and Beyond the Frame, Art and Illusion in America, 1790 to the present. Before coming to the High, Stephanie held curatorial positions at the Gulf Coast Museum of Art in Largo, Florida, and the Harvard University Art Museums and the Terra Museum of American Art. A graduate of Cornell University, Stephanie received the Master's of Arts in Art History from the University of Chicago and her PhD in Art History from Boston University. Audrey Lewis is Associate Curator at the Brandywine Museum of Art and has been a member of the curatorial staff at that museum since 2007. She is the co-curator with Stephanie Heydt of Joseph Stella, Visionary Nature, and contributed to the accompanying exhibition catalog. Her many other exhibitions at the Brandywine include Dawood Bey, Night Coming Tenderly Black, Andrew Wyeth in Retrospect, Horace Pippin, The Way I See It, Exalted Nature, The Real and Fantastic World of Charles Birchfield, Picturing Poe, Illustrations for Edgar Allan Poe's Stories and Poems, and Fruits of Summer, 19th Century American Still Life. Prior to her tenure at the Brandywine, Lewis was assistant project curator for the exhibition Forging an American Identity, The Art of William Ranney at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and was the research editor and project director for Soundview Press, where her major project was the multi-volume reference Who Was Who in American Art, 1564 to 1975, 400 Years of Artists in America. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie and Audrey. So we've been talking in preparation for today for a number of weeks about some things that some questions I had for the two of them. So we'll talk about that first, and we have some slides prepared for that. But then we'll open it up to you all if you have questions for them as well. So we're going to keep this conversational today, and I think we'll all learn a lot. So thank you again for coming. So my first question was where the initial idea for this show came. Because, let's see if I can make this slide work. As you all may know, this has never been done before. There's never been a major museum show about just about Joseph Stella's depictions of nature. So this is the first museum show focused on this, and I'm just curious where the idea came from the Brandywine, where the Brandywine got the idea.
Yeah. So back in 2017, our director, Thomas Payton, was visiting Seattle, a collector, Barney Ebsworth, who was a great collector of American art, had an amazing collection. And the first painting that he encountered when he went into the house was Tree of My Life, which is, he said he had an epiphany almost because it was so different than what we think of when we think of Joseph Stella, and you'll see as we go along what that means. So that was the initial, and he thought, well, what can we do at the Brandywine? Could we do something related to nature? Because that is the subject that hasn't really been approached. And then I think a few years later, or a year later, he was at the High Museum of Art, and I thought you'd take that.
Yeah. I encountered Tom in the galleries standing before our major and beautiful Stella Purissima. And we had a little conversation about it, and he said, how has no one done something on this before? And then, it was fun to imagine the possibility. And then a few months later, we received a loan request for a show that was in the works already. So we, of course, needed to join in on that, and was able to join what work was already done and build on top of that. It was really terrific opportunity.
Let's see, what next? And then I had asked them, oh, yes.
Well, actually, I did want to mention with Tree of My Life, what's extraordinary about this story is that if you can imagine, and this is the case for still so much art in our world, but Tree of My Life is one of Stella's masterworks, and it was in a private collection for decades, and not all that well known. And so this, it was acquired recently by now a public collection, and now it's more visible. But that was another reason why this show was so important, was, just at this moment when this major painting is becoming, brought into a public space, our show was developing around it. So another great sort of confluence of events.
Yeah. And then I had asked them what challenges came up when putting the show together.
Great. Well, the checklist initially came from Audrey, and we had a lot of works on paper on it. And for those of you who are collectors, or even if not, when you go visit a museum, very often you encounter sculpture and painting, and then maybe a special gallery that's darkened and maybe a changing space that would have works on paper because they're fugitive, too much light exposure, and we'll lose them over time. And so the practice of creating museum exhibitions, we also often have to dance around or sort of work around some of the limitations of the objects themselves. And we had a lot of works on paper because Stella was just a terrific draftsman, did much in this field. So each venue had to have a different set of works on paper for the presentation. So that was one challenge.
Yeah, and so we brought in the two. So this, as hopefully, how many people here have seen the show here? I'm hoping many people. Excellent. This is the self-portrait we have, or one of the two self-portraits we have here at the Norton, but then this one will be
At the Brandywine.
At the Brandywine,
Yeah.
and then there are a number of other self-portraits that will be in different at the High as well. So
Yeah. To really see Stella in his fullness, you have to come to all three of our venues, of course, because we have different portraits of him in each place.
yeah.
Also, we talked a little bit about just some of his techniques. Another challenge we had with the show, I think, in pulling it together was not every painting that we requested was able to travel, because also he had some experimental techniques. Sometimes his paint was mixed in such a way that like wet on wet paint doesn't always dry. This is getting a little technical, but so a lot of loans actually couldn't travel to the show. So we had to find other examples of his work out there. So we had to do a lot of digging, didn't we?
And a lot was in private collections. So we had to discover where these works that we were searching for might be. And we had help from other individuals across the country. But that was part of our job as curators is finding those. So it's a little bit of detective work, which is fun when we find out where they are. So we did find many that we were searching for. There's a few that we didn't, but we did very well.
I feel as if every time I talk to you all, you were like, "We found this. Do you want this?" Yes. I mean, that was an easy question. Let's see. And then I had asked them, what do you think you learned about Stella in the course of putting the show together, and did anything surprise you?
Yes.
Yeah, a lot.
Always.
It's a leading question.
So the slide we have up here, it wasn't necessarily a discovery we made, but I think as we were learning more about Stella, just aspects of his work and his personality just presented itself to us. But in our world, when we were studying the history of art back in graduate school and before that, if you're introduced to, or if you know Joseph Stella, largely you know him because of his work about American modernism, icons of American cities and urban spaces, such as really his first and most famous Brooklyn Bridge here, which is in the Yale University Art Gallery. And so it was a discovery. I was aware of his nature-based work, and actually it's his most prolific output was really on nature subjects. But people know him best for work such as the Brooklyn Bridge. But what was an interesting discovery for me personally was I was familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge painting, but I hadn't known how connected this other major work, Tree of My Life, was to that painting. In fact, they're exactly the same size, painted on very large canvases. And if you've seen the show, in person already, you know how large Tree of My Life is, down to the centimeter. I mean, they're exactly the same size. They were painted really one after the other. He was in the middle of painting and creating the Brooklyn Bridge when he had this epiphany, and he writes about it. And Stella uses words a lot and descriptions, and was, I guess an author in his own right. And he records this experience of while he's painting the Brooklyn Bridge, he's wandering through Brooklyn, and he comes across this little tree that's trying to grow in spite of the circumstances. It's in the shadow of a factory. It's, sort of wedged between the sidewalk and a building, but yet it's thriving, and it's sort of reaching for the light. And he has this epiphany that, this is what he feels like as he's an Italian immigrant. He'd left, sunny southern Italy for life in New York. Many thought maybe a better life, but he was always longing for Italy. And so this triggers for him just these memories that bring him back to Italy and to his childhood. And he creates this simultaneously while he's also painting this. I mean, two crazy different styles. And then he exhibits them together. So we know from this evidence that he creates them both the same size around the same time, and then purposefully puts them in front of an American audience at the same time together. It shows you the range of his world, but also how these two spheres that we might have a hard time connecting visually actually were intricately connected for him emotionally. So
Yeah, and his writings were what surprised me the most because he was so prolific in writing. His prose is very it's sensational. He writes in very vividly, almost in a visionary type manner in response to what he sees around him. So his response to the city, to Brooklyn Bridge, and to the urban environment was the same in terms of how vivid and spiritual his response was to nature. So they were very similar, even though he talked about the city as something that eventually he felt suffocated in. But it was still visually appealing to him, and I think nature always was, even since his childhood. But his writings are really very much inspired by Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman, very poetic and, as I said, very sensory and sensational in a sense, because he describes ecstatic visions and, not true visions, but, in terms of his response to nature and dreamlike.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Let's see what we have next. Oh, and then we were going to talk about particular discoveries that were made particularly about Tree of My Life. And I want to say also that if you're interested in this, we do have an iPad mounted in the gallery where you can make these kind of explorations yourself about like different quadrants of Tree of My Life. It's such a complicated painting and so detailed. So this kind of helps you understand where different elements of the composition maybe came from. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Stella, from the time he got to New York in, what was it, in 1897 or so, he began to take walks in New York, and one of the places he encountered was the Bronx, the New York, the New York Botanical Gardens, Botanical Gardens, and that became his kind of mecca in New York for the rest of his life. And he began visiting there, he was painting, and this painting, Tree of My Life, was very much inspired by his visits to the Botanical Gardens, and it's discussed in our catalog by Carly Wurzbacher, who is the curator of the Heckscher. And she describes what a modern marvel the conservatory was, with its glass dome, with its glass pane all throughout the building, and how the flowers from all over the world were presented together. So it wasn't as if they were presented from Africa, from tropics. They were all together in a way that was unlike what it is in nature, but that was inspiring to Stella, and you see it throughout his career that he is combining things that wouldn't be in nature. So even though he's closely observing what he sees and painting from that, it's also a lot of imaginative and kind of fantastical in responses to what he sees. So it's very beautiful, and you can see in this detail on the upper right corner and up there as well. It kind of simulates what you see in this glass dome in terms of the framework. So and I know that there are many other aspects of it that Carly writes about in the catalog. But this painting is you just have to look at it in detail. But this is a great detail to show as you get a sense of what individual plants are. There's many birds, and I think you talk about the location of the work in the background, the landscape.
Yeah, so what you see here is his hometown, Moro Lucano, where he came from in southern Italy. And what always perplexed me was, I guessed that was what it was. It's been written about before. Also, so there was, other scholars guessing the same thing. But I couldn't figure out what that tower was. And right around the time that I was pondering this, the High Museum, we made a really terrific hire. I don't see him out there, but Kyle Mancuso, a research associate that we're working with at the High, I sort of pitched the question to him, and he came back with some historical documents from Moro Lucano, this little hill town, with this tower that was very prominently, presented here in postcard and other kind of historical pictures. And there was apparently a hydroelectric plant that had gone up in this tiny little medieval town in the interim after Stella had left and before he made it back. So he couldn't have seen it on his own, but so he must have heard about it or seen pictures of it. And maybe it's an homage to, this sort of history, this old, beautiful old town of his that he has memories of, and also its sort of new modern reach with this very prominent placement of the tube or whatever,
yeah.
smokestack.
Smokestack, yeah.
Yeah, so very interesting. There are just so many layers to unpack with this, and so we invite you to go and spend some time in front of the painting. More details. Apologies for the pixelation, but it was really just to point out some of the leitmotifs that just come up again and again. This curved sort of semi-cactus, semi-plant form here that you see, and also the cactus itself. I mean, you can find it in 3 or 4 other paintings in the exhibition, and those were just little discoveries. Maybe we don't even know what to do with them necessarily, but it's there. They recur in unexpected places. And then a fun reward for looking closely. I had never seen it in person, and so, but I talked to someone who had, and he made this amazing observation that the form that you see on the far left looks a lot like that, but in fact, the leaves are tiny birds, little birds, not flowers. And so that was fun to see in person too.
So up here.
They might be sparrows, and everything has meaning, but we don't always know, or will we ever know, what the meaning is. But if they're sparrows, the sparrow was the national bird of Italy. So there's some layered meaning in there.
Do we know, and this is not something we were going to talk about, but I'm just curious, do we know how he put this painting together? Is it kind of coming, and when he reuses those motifs like that, is he consciously saying, I'm going to put this lotus that I used here in this quadrant, or is he kind of letting it kind of happen free form without planning?
No,
I don't. Yeah.
He's prolific in terms of the sketches that he made as well.
Yeah.
So there's many out there. So it's hard to know which ones. Although I'm really excited that we found these 2 that are within this painting.
Yeah.
And some artists write a lot about their process. Stella wrote a lot, but nothing about his process.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
No breadcrumbs.
See, another detail.
Again, yeah. So and also this gives you a sense for the range that he's working with, right? I mean, this very ethereal pastel, which is gorgeous, the swans, using the nocturnal tones. If you're familiar with the symbolists who worked in France at the turn of the century, I mean, he's quoting from different places. He's also looking back to the Renaissance and to sort of Italian traditions as well. And they're all just sort of layered. So this is really the perfect painting to launch an exhibition about Stella and his investigations into nature, because it's almost, you find almost everything in it. And then, you can spend the rest of the exhibition already feeling familiar with what you're encountering.
Yeah, so much to see.
The herons. Yeah. Okay.
There he is.
People have written about the tree and Stella as the tree for him being an expression of himself. He identified with trees. There's some great examples in the show. One of the earliest drawings we have is a little piece of bark, and go take a close look at it. It's gorgeous. It shows you how skilled he was as a draftsman. But he seems to have this identity with trees throughout his life, and so I just thought this was a great picture because this Italian olive tree with all of its sort of imperfections, shall we say, seems to resemble his own physical form.
And he includes them in his self-portraits as well. Sometimes the tree becomes one of the motifs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we were talking about how another thing that we discovered are they discovered when they were doing this research was how important travel was for Stella.
Well, Audrey
Yeah.
did a chronology. Yeah.
Yes. So he traveled consistently throughout his career. He was in New York, and then he went to Italy. First, he went to Paris in 1912 or 1911, and from there he went back to Italy. He went to Naples, Assisi, Pompeii, and so he continued to do this this travel every few years. So he spent many years actually in Paris and Italy later on. So he was a little bit restless, I think, and also he was seeking out something in his travels, and he was seeking out beauty, but also he describes in his writings. It sounds almost like a spiritual quest. He was fulfilled by what he found in nature, and so he continued searching for that, and that feeling, I think, too, that feeling of ecstasy that he describes so beautifully. Yeah.
And also a little of his unrest had to do with maybe also a feeling of displacement. When he came to the United States as a young man, I think he was in 18, 19, lived with his brother, who was an established physician, but they were always associated with the Italian community, at least, certainly when Stella first arrived. And it was a community that wasn't largely embraced, I think, in America at that time. I mean, being from southern Italy was sort of the lowest rung of the totem pole in terms of, immigrant hierarchies. And so he always felt a little bit of an outsider, and he deliberately, it's been written about that he deliberately retained his Italian accent, like a thick sort of full-on Italian accent for all the years that he lived in the United States, even after many decades later he becomes a U.S. citizen. And, but so he always identifies himself as an Italian, but when it was remarked when he was in Europe, he was always seen as too American. So where did he fit in? And we just, in conversation yesterday, talking about it, wondered if later in life, he goes, just for a brief period of time, but a really sort of important moment for him, he goes to Barbados, and he writes about Barbados as some place that he just feels at home. He feels embraced and he feels comfortable. And we wondered if maybe because there was no expectation of him being Italian or American or anything, just himself, if that was part of that, ease for him in that space.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. He certainly loved the climate as well, because it seems he loves that light and air and color, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. This is our wall of the Barbados pictures from the show.
Yeah.
And then some new research also that has been coming out about the banyan tree painting.
Well, again, this is something I passed on to my colleague at the High Museum, Kyle Mancuso. And I don't know why we questioned whether it was a banyan tree. I've seen banyan trees, and they have the sort of tendrils that drop down and form new trunks, and they're wonderful trees. And I remember, Ellen, you said if nothing else, we've got to have the banyan tree picture for this.
Yeah, it's perfect for us, as we have our great banyan tree
signature tree out there. But Kyle sent this picture and some questions along to various arboretums, and we actually received some word back that in fact it probably, or it may not be, it might likely be something else, not a banyan tree. I don't know if it warrants changing the title, but it was proposed that it was, this is how nitty gritty we get, a baobab tree, which is actually from largely found on the continent of Africa, and not necessarily in Barbados, but there are two baobab trees in Barbados, and one is a very prominent, in the center of town tree. So we wondered if this could be that tree.
We still want it to be a banyan tree, but we were also. I think what has been fascinating for all of us is just seeing there are so many of these beautiful silver point drawings. But what I think really happens when you study them is that you can kind of see that there is a difference between the early ones and the late ones.
Right. So Stella was not great at, recording his own actions and whereabouts and whatever, or dating any of his work. So there's been a lot of speculation, some, flags in the sand that erodes at some point. And, as you try and place and piece together his career and where things fit, you have to really use your visual sensibilities and your understanding of his work over time. And I would say, Audrey and I became pretty tuned in to, how things look different at different moments in his career. Even if he's still painting or making pictures of, drawing, in this case, flowers, there's something about the late works that, he fills up more of the paper. There's just a different sensibility, a different approach to maybe less delicate, more forceful.
More lush.
So the gardenia was a gift to the High when I was first starting there a couple of years ago. And it was undated, and we always have to have a circa, like take your best guess. And so I did a little research on Stella at that time, and I dated it to, I think, 1919, which is when everyone puts all the drawings. Like, that's when he started going to the botanical gardens around that time. And then this show really, I think, had me rethink that, and we redated it to later.
Yeah, there's more of an evolution than I thought there would be.
Yeah.
In his drawings.
They seem softer to me.
Yeah.
Many of them.
Yeah.
Oh, and then this is a great. So I think, and Audrey already mentioned that. I think fascinating thing about Stella is just how much he wrote, and he's just so articulate. And many artists maybe are not that articulate, or it's not that useful to read what they write. But I think for Stella, it really is. So this was a great quote that.
He wrote a whole poem about a gardenia, and we just couldn't resist lifting from it and putting it alongside the gardenias in the exhibition. But this also leads into, so at the High Museum, part of the focus or the turn, I guess, that we're taking with our show is that we're really letting the visitor be guided by Stella's words. So you've incorporated some of his quotes, and we're doing the same. And then we've developed a film that is quite literally just Stella talking over, just images that we've assembled from the show and from other places. And it's a work in progress, and we decided we'd share just a clip from it, just 2 segments. It will be a loop. There's no beginning, no end, just like Stella. I guess like all of his work is like, but just a note. So the words that you'll be hearing, and it's also, in subtitle, are Stella's words. But the voice you'll be hearing is our lovely videographer, Carly, who was like, this was what she showed me to pitch the idea for the show. And then the quotes were found, we assembled them together, Kyle and I. And we're trying to see if the Brandywine might want to show this.
I think we would.
But imagine, if you will, over the lovely voice of Carly, if you can pretend to hear a deep-voiced Italian man, which actually we just hired a voice actor, and he's amazing. So
here it is, this little sneak peek.
The true artist selects for his translation in the permanent realm of art only what is essential, eloquent for all times. Painting is high poetry. Things must be transfigured by the magic hand of the artist. The greatest effort of an artist is to catch and render permanent that blissful moment of his when he sees things out of normal proportion, elevated and spiritualized, appearing new, as seen for the first time. The language of the painter must be precise and elusive in the same time to convey any delicacy of feeling. His style must be clear and terse. The lines must be drawn firm and cutting, as those setting the character of the objects. And the form, dressed in the most magnificent, lustrous clear color, must be full, in plenitude, ready to blossom. I thank the Lord for having the good fortune to be born in a mountain town. My native village, Muro Lucano, wedges its stubborn roots in the tortuous viscera of a rocky hillside. Its sturdy houses are constructed of living rock and fieldstone, and, pulled together of rocks scattered all around, they stand in the form of an amphitheater, back to back, leaning against each other like rows of sentinels ready for an attack, protected from above and watched over by the crenellated towers of the medieval castle.
So it's fun, I think.
Yeah.
I'll let Carly know.
They approve.
She'll be happy.
Yeah, and then we were also talked about how, well, and we talked about this already a little bit, but about how Stella is combining elements from nature that wouldn't actually appear together. And that this is an interesting example of that, just because it's called Flowers Italy, but not all the flowers are not Italian. Right.
Most of them, right?
Yeah.
They're from all over.
They're
I
from
mean,
all over, yeah.
like even I can identify some of them, like hibiscus. But we did sit down with a botanist in Atlanta from the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, and she gave us a long list of what we see in here. And then, of course, there are other things where she's like, that's just, I don't know, that's a thing that he made up. So it's fun to take a close look at it.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful painting. This, I think another thing that, so for the catalog, I wrote about Stella's use of different materials, because I think a thing that really impresses me about him is just his mastery of all of these different materials, and the fact that he kind of chooses different materials depending on what he's trying to do in his art. So I just brought in this image of just this wall from the show, just because it gives you a sense of how he's doing this oil on reverse painting on glass here. He does collages, he does silver point, but also mixes it with oil paint with this portrait of Duchamp, which is very unusual. And here's an actual oil painting. So I think just in this one wall, you get a sense of the range of his work in terms of the different materials. And in particular with the silver points, this is a time of silver point revival after World War I, when a lot of artists were kind of trying to get back to something they could understand that was kind of not rooted in modern technology, because they associate modern technology with the war and with the kind of great destruction that it brought. So they're kind of clinging to the past in a way. And so this is the same time that Picasso, for instance, is having his neoclassical period. So this is the same kind of impulse for Stella, I think, going back to use more silver point, this kind of ancient medium that's very labor intensive. And what's interesting about Stella, in particular, with his silver points, is that by this time with silver point, you can buy paper that's prepared for silver point. So one of the reasons it's so labor intensive is that you can't just take a silver stylus and draw it across paper and make a line. As you all know, if you tried to do that, nothing would happen. So you have to prepare that paper. Stella used gouache to prepare the paper. But by this time, you could buy paper that was commercially prepared for silver point. So if you look at Marsden Hartley uses silver point at this time, John Storrs uses silver point, other Stella's contemporary modernist artists in the U.S., but they're buying those prepared papers. Stella insisted on preparing his own papers. He wants to be able to control that medium, and I think he kind of liked the fact that it was so hard. And what's great about having the actual silver points here, they do not reproduce well, so it's very hard to see this on the screen. But this one in particular, if you go look at it in the galleries, you can see his hand in the background where he painted on that gouache. And then this is our silver point here from the Norton's collection. And what you can see there is that he comes back after he makes the drawings on the paper and adds more ground around them, so that it makes the drawings stand out even more. So these are things. This is why it's great to have the actual objects here. So I would again encourage you to go and look at the actual objects in the exhibition. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and as you said, I mean, he was deliberately choosing the more labor-intensive, and he writes about this. He writes about how one of the reasons why he chooses silver point was that not anyone can do it. It's difficult, and it's unforgiving. Once you make a line, you can't, no, I don't like that. You have to throw out the whole paper, but you're already invested in that piece of paper.
you
don't want to. So he was very deliberate in that way. And then, as you were saying, Ellen, it's an ancient technique, and he goes and does research on what the recipes were that the Italian masters used in the Renaissance. So this is another way for him to express his identity, to express his affiliation with Italy and with the traditions of Italy. But also, I mean, look how refined and careful and precise these drawings are. And then compare that to some of the paintings that are, very expressive and, just layers of paint. He can do almost anything, I'm convinced, and make a success out of it. Really, that was a discovery. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we also talked about how, like, although it's very detailed, I mean, it's so precise, and that's one of the reasons he loved Silver Point. It's not actually realistic. The finished Silver Point drawings are just as kind of imaginative as the paintings, in the sense that this one is called Lupin, but then there are all these other flowers that have been added onto it, and it's not clear how they relate to each other,
It's
right?
almost like you want to see them like botanical specimen, like the kind of scientific drawings that you would encounter in a botanist library. But in fact, he plays a little trick on you because none of these things could you ever find in nature, right? I mean, unless you crafted one like with all 12 different flowers and layered them together. And, there's been suggestion that part of the impetus for this kind of creative hybridization of flowers was that it's what he would have seen at the botanical gardens, like layers of, first you see a lupine, but then you see, a gardenia, and then a
Water lily or
water
lotus.
Yeah. And so he just shows you what he's experiencing in this kind of abstract, almost surrealist way.
And that at a botanical garden, you wouldn't necessarily encounter, say, like all things that were from Africa in one place. They're all kind of mixed up together, and that's what he does in his work.
Yeah.
And then we also talked about what would be different about and why you should go see the exhibition at the Brandywine and the High as well. So what would be different about their installations of this show than the installation here?
Yeah, I was really interested early on with just this pendulum swing he was making between the urban works and this nature work. And I knew, of course, this is a exhibition about nature, but I couldn't help myself. I had to do a little exploring on my own. And I was sort of struck by some of his earlier works. He was given a commission to go to document the workers and the work conditions in Western Pennsylvania and some of the coal mines and steel mills. And you would expect from a commission like that you'd come back with, and he was really a great draftsman, so he certainly also had these, pictures of actual people and workers and the conditions, but he also came back with a suite of works that look like this. These very atmospheric, just kind of beautiful renderings of these places that he saw that, he writes about as soul-crushing and sad, but these are so interesting because you can see the industry, but you also see the way in which natural forms, in this case, probably smoke and smog, are embracing them and sort of changing your interaction with these harsh industrial spaces. So I read this in a way that I just wanted to share with our audiences. And we have a much bigger platform for this show, so I was able to include them.
Yeah, that's great. And I think what's interesting to me about what happened with our installation is that because of where it is in the museum and the colors we picked, I think you almost get kind of immersive sense. This gallery in particular has quite a low ceiling for a museum gallery. So it has a kind of a very different sense, I think, than you might have in other museum galleries. So I'm just curious whether you have a sense of what your installation will look like.
Well, at the Brandywine, we are in the 19th century mill, so it's a very different feeling inside. But like you, our walls aren't very high, but they're high enough. But I think it will be more intimate in terms of the installation. Also, we will have a second gallery, a smaller gallery, but beautifully and brand new, in which we plan on hanging some of the works on paper, some of the drawings and smaller works, so that you can really experience them in an immersive way. You can spend time in front of each one, get a sense of what he was doing, and we also have a relationship with the Longwood Gardens, and I'm imagining programming that will relate, similar to what Kyle did talking to horticulturists. We're hoping to bring some people in, maybe exchange tours with them. Because Longwood Gardens is an amazing place. And they have, like the conservatory, the botanical gardens, they have plants from all over the world, many and in different combinations. So that relationship, I think, will be important to the museum, the experience of our visitors. And they'll get a chance to go to both places, perhaps. And so, and the color, I love this color. So we probably will have, I don't know if we'll have the same colors, but we'll be definitely not putting them on white walls. We'll be using color that will go with these paintings in terms of, bringing out the best of them. They're so bold and colorful.
Yeah.
I love the jewel box you've created here. I mean, they feel special. And then
I think intimate is the right word too. For these kind of galleries.
And this passage between light and dark and open feeling spaces and embracing. Our galleries have ceilings this high, so it'll be a very different experience.
Yeah, so we should definitely all go see it there.
Yeah.
We have many things we want to say, but I think at this point we should ask you all if you have any questions, and then we can continue. But yes.
This is just a clarification for me and maybe for some others. Where's Brandywine?
Oh,
Where is
yeah.
High Museum?
Yeah.
The gardens you mentioned, please.
That's
please
a very
tell
good
us.
question. Thank you. The Brandywine is in Chadsford, Pennsylvania. It is a lovely, it's about a half hour from Philadelphia and a half hour to Wilmington, Delaware. So it's sort of in between. We're right on the river. So it's a beautiful bucolic setting. We are a rather small museum. We've traditionally been regional, but we're expanding that now. People often associate us with the Wyeths. Andrew Wyeth was a Chadsford resident, N.C. Wyeth, his father, an illustrator, and Jamie Wyeth, Andrew's son, also painter. So we have 3 generations of the Wyeth. So we have a mixture now. We are able to, one of the reasons that we wanted to do this show was not only because it's so interesting and beautiful, but we have our parent company. Our parent is it's the museum and it's the conservancy. Our conservancy, the Brandywine Conservancy, preserves natural resources in the area, water and land. So there's that. Even though Stella was not an environmentalist, but I think that interest in art and nature will really work well in our setting.
Yeah. And the High Museum is in the middle of downtown Atlanta. So
Atlanta, yeah.
We don't have a lot of nature around us, but it'll be a nice discovery for people. We're actually just about a half mile away from our own botanical garden, so we are thinking about some interesting collaborations with them.
And the Longwood Gardens that you mentioned, Audrey, are they near?
They're about a 10-minute drive.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Oh, is it that close?
Yeah. It's called Longwood Gardens. Yeah, Longwood. And it's very near the museum.
So I had a question. Was he a successful artist? I mean, was he selling paintings during his lifetime, or was he discovered after? Like, when was he famous?
Yeah,
I guess is my
discuss that.
question.
Yeah, we did. That's a great question. The question was he a famous artist
During his
was he
lifetime.
successful during his lifetime? And the answer is yes. And sort of a double-edged sword, because he started off with a big bang, 1913, 1914, with some of his early paintings that were very future forward, very modernist, interesting for Americans had never seen them before. This kind of, I don't know, very modern style, futuristic style. And then, and he gets a lot of press about it. He's a bit of a celebrity for a little bit of time. He's hanging out with people like Marcel Duchamp, and if you know the fountain, the toilet basically that shows up at a exhibition, later in the 1910s. He's part of this very very famous group, and then he goes, as Audrey was explaining, back and forth between the United States and Italy, and makes and Europe, really makes some exchange there. He's pretty well known in Europe too, but then he starts really digging into these nature themed paintings, and I think audiences and critics in particular start not quite knowing what to make of it. I mean, they're spiritual. They're referencing, sort of Catholic subjects. They're, the Purissima in this. I mean, they're like, what do we do with this? It was so unusual. It's still unusual today to look at these. And so it wasn't that he wasn't successful, and he had some clients that actually were very interested in him, like Carl Weeks, a very wealthy man who lived in Iowa, who became sort of an unlikely patron of his. But he did kind of lose a little ground with the more progressive set, and even his biggest champions didn't really know how to support him in his career. But he kept doing it. He kept making what he wanted to make.
Yeah, and I think there was also maybe in the 1920s into the 30s, some of the people who were such advocates for him just began to feel uncomfortable explaining him and seeing it as two different directions that he was in. Even though we have found that we don't think there is, but there's definitely that perception. His color is questioned. In some cases, it's called garish. And the religious subjects were not really being done in the United States at all. So that was different too.
Is it Henry McBride who writes writes about how he says, Stella's clearly very talented, but to what use is he putting that talent? Is this what he should be painting? Which is interesting.
They just wanted more Brooklyn bridges, basically.
Yeah.
And he actually paints them throughout his career. Yeah. The one that's in the show here, he paints it while he's in Paris in 1929, 1930. And there's in preparation for his first big solo show in Paris. So he's been invited to present the best of himself. But what they want is his Brooklyn Bridge. And he actually couldn't get Yale's, the one that was in a private collection at the time. He couldn't get that over in time. So he just made another one. And then he continues to return to it. What's interesting, and this is going a little too deep in the weeds, but he makes them well into the 1930s, and some of them are almost like a yin and yang again. He goes back to, he'll make a nature subject that has exactly the same proportions and some of the same kind of, dynamic compositions as the Brooklyn Bridge that he's making at the same time in 1940. So he returns to this both and kind of approach to nature and industry throughout his life. So whenever things start looking a little bleak for him, here's another Brooklyn Bridge. Everyone's like, okay, there it is, it's back again.
Oh, yes.
At the special event last night, which was wonderful, as all your special events are, and as this is as well, the issue was brought up as to whether or not, and Stephanie Heydt, I think, was the person who was showing us through the gallery personally, but it came up at other times as well, whether or not he was influenced by the work of O'Keeffe, or O'Keeffe was influenced by him.
We came prepared.
And a question that came to my mind was, is it ever possible that two artists just seem to have the same epiphanies at the same time, coincidentally? But I wonder if you could address that. Thank you.
Well, I think that one thing that is important to recognize is that inspiration goes both ways, so it's certainly true that Stella and O'Keeffe would have known each other. It's quite a small world, the New York art world at that time, so they would have known each other, and they would have known each other's work. So even if they, and Stella increasingly, as he got older, was kind of increasingly curmudgeonly, was kind of like, I have no connection to the contemporary art world, But of course that's not true, and you can't, and I said this last night, you can't trust artists, what they say about their work, and so they, he's clearly, even if he's not doing it consciously, he's aware of what she's doing, and the same thing is in the reverse is true. But I also think that what you're saying is right, which is that there was something in the air at this time in the 1920s that made them want go back to nature. And I mean, I have this theory about World War I. I mean, that the whole culture was kind of trying to find meaning after this terrible war. How can we make art in the face of that war? What do we do? Do we go back to neoclassical, classical art like Picasso did? Do we go to nature? There many artists are making a shift at that time, and I think you could argue that both O'Keeffe and Stella are making that shift in the same direction, just because that's the direction they want to go. So yeah, it's a good question, I think. But what do you all think?
Well, I was going to say, and I think I mentioned this last night, but we aren't the first to make this observation. And while O'Keeffe was still alive, an art historian asked that very question of where, who came up with the flower idea? Were you and Stella talking? I think it was a little more subtle than that. And she said, no. I mean, we were aware of each other, but I was doing my thing and he was doing. And so this is, of course, an artist looking back retrospectively. And as Ellen said, you can't always trust the words of an artist. We don't know what the full story was, but there's a story there. We just might never know it.
Other questions? Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for putting on this excellent exhibit. One of the things that you all brought up at the beginning of this talk was the difficulty of transport, the wet on wet paint, the lighting as the conversation went on, and a word that stood out to me in the exhibit was alchemical, and how he would use these different techniques and types of paint. Is there something, as you were collaborating and curating this exhibit, that really stood out to you as truly innovative or unique that you had not known before about his various styles and paintings?
I mean,
it's a good question.
I don't know, but
yeah.
I do remember a critic, though, using that same word, alchemy,
Yeah.
and discussing his color and how he brings these colors together that really have, in theory, have no business really being next to each other in nature. But as far as innovative techniques, I mean, the silver point was really an experiment for him. And did you talk about how that works?
This painting, when it was first shown, there's an amazing review by the New York Times critic at the time. And he talks, I think that he does use that word alchemical, and also says that it's as if Stella had dipped his brush into the Aurora Borealis. So to me, that was a very helpful quote, because I think it kind of shows that his contemporaries realized, what he was doing was very strange and very kind of innovative, and that it is kind of otherworldly. So I think that is the right word, alchemical. Almost like he's inventing something new with his materials. Other questions?
How old was he when he immigrated?
He was 18.
18.
How old was he when he immigrated was the question, which he was 18. So, yes.
And so he wrote in his visionary style. In Italian or in English?
He did, in Italian, yeah.
And so those are translations you were giving us?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
So many of his women make us think of the Madonna. And I'm wondering, in his personal life, was he a religious person? Was he a church-going person? Because there's so many references here to Madonna-like women.
That's a great question. He did identify, he had a Catholic upbringing. His community was Catholic, where he was raised in rural Lucano. The Catholic ceremonies, the various holidays. But he himself shied away from practicing religion. He wasn't, in fact, he if anything, he ran away from it. But he was very spiritual. And so these are they're more odes to his cultural heritage, to memories of his experiences, not so much, Catholic expressions as they are an embrace of sort of a spiritual embodiment of his memory. And the way that nature is so integrated in there, it's clear how important nature was in his sort of spiritual practice.
Other questions? I think there's one right here.
Hi, ladies. Thank you so much. This was my first exposure to Stella, and I'm really enamored.
The first word that kept coming up for me over and over, especially with his plant-based paintings and, the Madonna-style paintings, is the word psychedelic. So I was curious if there's anything in his personal writings or anything in his own life experience that he talks about that's similar to that.
His writings are psychedelic.
Are they?
Yeah.
They really are.
They take you on a journey for sure.
Yeah, he describes in his experiences. He describes having these visions and then how he draws from that to create a painting. He did that with Tree of My Life, a long essay or sorts about how he went from that to Brooklyn Bridge. Yeah.
And we didn't really talk so much about it, but he was involved with the Surrealist group, and they were very much about sort of probing the depths, and Freud and all this stuff is becoming popular at this point. So, he was right on beat, with the moment, I think.
I've had multiple people, though, say that use that word in speaking to me about Stella since we put the show up. So it's interesting. Psychedelic, people have actually asked me, did he do psychedelic drugs, which is interesting.
Well, one fun activity, go stand in front of the gorgeous Purissima, which is in the Hayes collection. And it looks very symmetrical until you realize it's not. Like one head is higher than the other, and of the herons, and the flowers are actually evolving from, if you look at the top with the lilies, one is open, one is in full, sort of past bloom, and he gives you it's sort of a journey within the painting itself. So something on surface that looks one way unfolds and is something completely else. So.
Other questions? Oh, there's one right here.
When I looked at the slide juxtaposition of the Tree of Life and the Brooklyn Bridge, what I was really struck by is that the Brooklyn Bridge looked as if it was the center of the city, like it was the tree of a city, only it was made of of man-made materials and metal and urban, so it didn't come out of the dirt like the Tree of Life, but it came out of man-made materials, and the center structure is really the same.
People write about that. This is an element of his work that persists. In so many of the works, you can see this sort of central core. And in one, you have this gemstone, crystal at the bottom, which he writes about as sort of a generative of life. And then in the other, you have this, what did we decide that is? Is it like a bromelia? No, I don't know. I can't remember, but you can start seeing the similarities. Not only are they the same size in their canvas, but you're right. They have this anchor in the middle, the tree and the bridge structure, and then these things that radiate out or radiate in. It's a consistent approach he takes throughout his career.
I don't want to keep you all day, so I want to particularly thank Stephanie and Audrey for coming. And thank you for coming again, and please do our survey if you have a chance.